My name is Aria Lewis. I'm 32 years old, and let me tell you about the day my parents tried to move into my 900K downtown apartment and called me selfish for saying no. Have you ever felt guilty for wanting something that's just yours? For craving a personal space after fighting so hard to earn it? I know exactly how that feels, and what I'm about to share with you might sound crazy, but it's my truth. This is the story of how I learned that protecting what you've worked for isn't selfish. It's survival. You won't believe what happened next, but stick with me because this gets wild. It took me 10 years of grinding, saving every penny, and working 60-hour weeks at my marketing firm to finally buy my dream place in the heart of downtown Chicago. The moment I got those keys, I felt like I'd finally made it. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the skyline that took my breath away, and most importantly, it was mine. But that feeling of pure joy lasted exactly 3 weeks before everything changed. If you've ever had someone try to take something precious from you, hit that like button and subscribe, because I want to know I'm not alone in this. Have you ever worked so hard for something only to have family make you feel bad for protecting it? My parents, Linda and Robert Lewis, had always been the type to lean on me financially, and I'd helped them plenty of times over the years without hesitation. But this time was different. This wasn't about lending money or helping with bills. This was about my sanctuary, the one place I'd created just for me after years of living in cramped studio apartments and saying no to vacations so I could save. The pride I felt walking through that door every evening was something I'd never experienced before, and deep down, I knew my life was about to get complicated. It was a Saturday morning when my phone rang, and I saw Mom's name flash across the screen. Nothing unusual. We talked every weekend. "Honey, your father and I need to talk to you about something important," she said, her voice carrying that tone that immediately made my stomach drop. I invited them over for brunch, thinking maybe they needed another loan or help with their mortgage payment like before. But when they walked into my apartment that afternoon, I noticed they weren't just visiting. They had brought luggage, and Dad was carrying boxes from their car. Mom sat down on my new couch, the one I'd saved 3 months to buy, and dropped the bomb without any warning or gentle lead-in. "Sweetie, we can't afford our house anymore, and we thought since you have this big, beautiful apartment with 2 bedrooms, we could move in with you for a while." The words hit me like a truck, and I felt my heart start racing as I tried to process what she'd just said. Dad nodded along, adding that it made perfect sense, since I had the extra space and they were family after all. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you've ever had family make an impossible request. Drop a comment telling me how you handled it. I sat there frozen, watching them talk about which bedroom they'd take and how they'd rearrange my furniture to make room for their things. They hadn't asked. They'd already decided, and I was supposed to just go along with it because that's what good daughters do, right? My mind was screaming no, but my mouth couldn't form the words because I'd been trained my whole life to put their needs before mine. That's when I realized this wasn't just about them needing a place to stay. This was about them expecting me to sacrifice my peace, my privacy, and everything I'd worked for without even considering how I felt about it. The moment they left that evening, after I'd stammered something about needing to think about it, I collapsed on my couch and felt the weight of guilt crushing my chest. Was I being selfish? Was I really such a terrible daughter that I couldn't help my own parents when they needed me? These questions kept spinning in my mind like a tornado, and I couldn't sleep that night, staring at the ceiling of my beautiful bedroom that suddenly felt tainted. If you've ever felt torn between what you want and what others expect from you, please subscribe and hit that like button. I need to know there are others out there who understand this struggle. Have you ever been made to feel guilty for protecting something you earned with your own blood, sweat, and tears? I started questioning everything I'd worked for, wondering if all those years of sacrifice meant I owed my parents unlimited access to my life. Growing up, they'd always told me that family comes first, no matter what, and that message had been drilled into my head since I was a little girl. But now, at 32, with my own apartment and my own life, I was starting to realize that family first had always meant putting their needs before mine, never the other way around. The guilt was eating me alive, making me doubt whether I even deserved this apartment, or if I should just give in and let them move in to prove I wasn't a bad person. I called my best friend Maya that night, crying so hard I could barely speak, and she asked me a question that changed everything. "Aria, when was the last time your parents respected something you wanted without making you feel guilty about it?" I sat there in silence because I couldn't think of a single time, not even when I'd asked them to respect my decision to pursue marketing instead of becoming a doctor like they wanted. That realization hit me like a freight train. This pattern had been going on my entire life, and I'd been conditioned to believe that my wants, my dreams, and my boundaries didn't matter as much as theirs. The apartment wasn't really the issue. It was about whether I had the right to live my own life without carrying the burden of their expectations on my shoulders forever. The next few days were a nightmare of phone calls, text messages, and guilt trips that would make any manipulator proud. Mom called me every morning with a new reason why I should let them move in. The landlord was threatening to evict them. Dad's back hurt too much for him to work. They'd sacrificed so much for me when I was growing up. Each conversation left me feeling more drained and more conflicted, like I was being pulled apart from the inside. Dad even showed up at my office one afternoon, surprising me during my lunch break to tell me how disappointed he was that I was abandoning them in their time of need. The emotional manipulation was relentless and expertly crafted, using every childhood memory and obligation they could weaponize against me. "Remember when we paid for your college textbooks?" Mom would say. Or, "We could have bought a nicer house instead of saving for your education." Dad used a different approach, playing the victim card by saying things like, "I guess we raised you wrong if you can't even help your old parents when we're struggling." Every conversation made me feel smaller, like I was this ungrateful, selfish monster who cared more about material things than her own flesh and blood. Subscribe and like this video if you've ever dealt with family members who make you feel guilty for having boundaries. Comment below and tell me how you survived it, because I really thought I was losing my mind. What hurt the most wasn't just the pressure, it was the realization that they didn't see me as a person with my own needs and feelings. To them, I was just a resource, a solution to their problems, and my feelings about giving up my privacy and my sanctuary didn't matter at all. They never once asked how I felt about it, never considered that maybe I'd bought this apartment specifically to have a space that was completely mine after years of living with roommates and dealing with other people's chaos. The pressure kept building day after day, and I started to wonder if maybe it would be easier to just give in and let them move in rather than deal with this constant barrage of guilt and manipulation. But deep down, a small voice inside me was screaming that if I gave in now, I'd be giving in for the rest of my life, and this apartment would become a symbol of everything I'd sacrificed instead of everything I'd achieved. What came next was something I never expected from the people who raised me. They started using every trick in the manipulation playbook to break me down. Mom began sending me old family photos with captions like, "Remember when we were a real family?" And Dad would call me late at night, his voice shaking, telling me he didn't know how much longer they could survive on the streets. The word streets hit me hard because they weren't actually homeless yet. They still had their house for another month, but they were painting the darkest picture possible to make me crack. If this story is hitting close to home and you've dealt with family manipulation, smash that like button and subscribe so I know I'm not crazy for feeling this way. Has anyone in your family ever twisted the truth to make you feel like you had no choice but to give them what they wanted? They even started involving other family members, turning my aunts and uncles against me by telling them I was refusing to help my poor, desperate parents. My Aunt Sarah called me one evening, practically screaming at me about how ungrateful I was and how my parents had sacrificed everything for me. What she didn't know was that my parents had conveniently left out the part where they'd blown their savings on a boat they couldn't afford and multiple vacations while I was eating ramen noodles to save for my apartment. The manipulation wasn't just about making me feel guilty. It was about isolating me, making me feel like I was the villain in a story where I was actually just trying to protect my mental health and my hard-earned space. The breaking point came when Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced, tears streaming down her face, telling me that Dad had chest pains, and it was all because of the stress I was causing them by being so selfish. My heart dropped, and I immediately offered to drive them to the hospital, but she waved me off and said what he really needed was the peace of mind that comes from having a stable home. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about love or family. This was about control, and they were willing to use any weapon they had, including fake health scares, to get what they wanted. But what happened next changed everything, and you won't believe how I finally found the courage to stand up for myself. Saying no to people you love is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, especially when those people have spent your entire life conditioning you to believe that saying no makes you a bad person. I sat in my apartment for hours, rehearsing the conversation in my head, trying to find the perfect words that would make them understand without making me sound like a monster. Every time I practiced saying, "I can't let you move in," my throat would tighten and my eyes would fill with tears, because I felt like I was breaking some sacred family code. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video if you've ever struggled to set boundaries with people who refuse to respect them, and drop a comment telling me how you finally found your voice, because I desperately needed to find mine. The fear of being labeled selfish was so overwhelming that I almost caved several times, my finger hovering over my phone ready to text them, "Okay, you can move in." But each time I came close, I'd look around my apartment. At the walls I'd painted myself, at the furniture I'd carefully chosen, at the view I'd dreamed about for years, and something inside me would revolt against the idea of giving it all up. I started journaling every night, writing down all the times I'd sacrificed my own needs for theirs, and the list was so long it filled an entire notebook. From giving up my college fund money to help pay their mortgage, to canceling my own plans countless times to help them with things they could have handled themselves, I'd been putting them first my entire adult life. The real challenge wasn't just saying no, it was dealing with the aftermath, the guilt, and the fear that I was destroying my relationship with my parents forever. I realized that setting this boundary meant accepting that they might hate me for it, that family gatherings would be awkward, and that I might lose the image of being the good daughter I'd worked so hard to maintain. But I also realized something even more important. If I didn't establish this limit now, I never would, and I'd spend the rest of my life sacrificing my happiness for people who saw me as a resource rather than a person with my own dreams and needs. The moment of truth was coming, and I had to decide once and for all whether my peace of mind was worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone. Looking back at my life, I realized this wasn't the first time my parents had used guilt to get what they wanted, and it definitely wasn't the first time I'd almost given in to keep the peace. When I was 23 and got my first real job offer in another state, they'd convinced me to turn it down because they needed me close and couldn't imagine their lives without me nearby. I gave up that opportunity, and 3 months later, they barely called me because they were too busy with their own lives. If you've ever sacrificed your dreams for people who didn't appreciate it, please hit that like button and subscribe. I want to hear your stories in the comments because knowing I'm not alone in this would mean everything to me. What's the biggest opportunity you gave up for someone who didn't value your sacrifice? The pattern was so clear once I started really looking at it. Every major decision in my life had been influenced by their guilt trips and manipulation. I'd stayed in my hometown for college instead of going to my dream school in California because they said they'd be heartbroken if I left. I'd loaned them money countless times, money I never saw again, because they'd made me feel like a bad daughter if I said no. I'd even broken up with a guy I really loved because they didn't approve of his career choice, and they'd made every family dinner so uncomfortable that I eventually caved just to stop the fighting. Each sacrifice I'd made had chipped away a little piece of my identity until I barely recognized the person I'd become. The most painful realization was that my parents had never made the same sacrifices for me. They'd always put their own comfort and desires first while making me feel selfish for wanting even a fraction of what they took for granted. When I'd asked them to come to my college graduation, they'd said they couldn't make it because they'd already planned a cruise, but when they needed money for that same cruise, I was expected to help without question. This apartment wasn't just about square footage and a nice view. It represented the first time in my adult life that I'd put myself first, and they couldn't stand that because it meant I was finally breaking free from their control. The question was, did I have the strength to keep that freedom, or would I fall back into the same old pattern? The moment everything changed happened on a random Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting in a therapy session that my friend Maya had practically forced me to book. My therapist, Dr. Jennifer Park, asked me a simple question that shattered my entire worldview. Aria, if a friend came to you with this exact situation, what would you tell them to do? I opened my mouth to answer, and the words that came out shocked me. I'd tell them to protect their space, to say no, and to not feel guilty about it. But somehow, I couldn't give myself that same compassion and understanding. And that's when I realized I'd been treating myself worse than I'd treat a stranger on the street. Dr. Park helped me understand something crucial that day, that setting boundaries wasn't about being mean or selfish. It was about self-preservation and self-respect. She told me that people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, even if they don't like them, because they care more about your well-being than their own convenience. My parents weren't respecting my boundaries because they'd never had to. I'd always caved before, always put their needs first, always sacrificed my own happiness to keep them comfortable. The apartment situation wasn't really about the apartment at all. It was about whether I was finally ready to value myself as much as I valued everyone else in my life. That session gave me a clarity I'd never experienced before. Like someone had turned on the lights in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark for 32 years. I realized that saying yes to them would mean saying no to myself, to my peace, to my mental health, and to the future I'd worked so hard to build. The guilt was still there, heavy and suffocating, but underneath it was something stronger, a fierce determination to finally, after all these years, choose myself. I walked out of that office knowing exactly what I had to do, even though the thought of actually doing it terrified me more than anything else in my life. What happened next would either destroy my relationship with my parents forever, or finally teach them that I wasn't their puppet anymore. And honestly, I didn't know which outcome scared me more. I invited my parents over one last time, but this time I was prepared with a script I'd practiced dozens of times with Dr. Park and a resolve that felt like steel in my chest. When Linda and Robert walked through my door, they had that expectant look on their faces, like they'd already won, and I was just going to hand over my keys and my life without another word of protest. I took a deep breath, looked them both in the eyes, and said the words I'd been too scared to say my entire life. Mom, Dad, I love you, but you cannot move into my apartment, and I need you to respect that decision. If you're watching this, and you've ever had to choose between your peace and someone else's demands, please subscribe and hit that like button. Your support means everything to me. Have you ever had to say no to someone you love, knowing it might change everything between you forever? The silence that followed was deafening, and I watched my mother's face go from shock to anger to something that looked almost like disgust. Are you seriously going to let your own parents be homeless while you live in this luxury apartment all by yourself? She hissed, her voice dripping with venom that I'd heard before, but never fully recognized as manipulation until that moment. Robert stood up, his face red with rage, and started listing every single thing they'd ever done for me, as if my entire childhood was just a transaction, and now I owed them an infinite debt that could never be repaid. But this time, instead of crumbling under the weight of their guilt, I stood firm and reminded myself of what Dr. Park had told me. No is a complete sentence, and I don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting my well-being. I explained calmly that I'd be happy to help them find resources, connect them with social services, or even help with a security deposit for a more affordable place, but my apartment was off the table and that boundary was non-negotiable. The look of shock on their faces told me everything. They'd never expected me to actually stand up for myself, to choose my own mental health over their convenience and comfort. Mom tried one last manipulation tactic, tears streaming down her face as she told me I'd regret this decision for the rest of my life. But I stood at my door and asked them to leave if they couldn't respect my choice. Walking them out that day was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and as I closed the door behind them, I wasn't sure if I felt relieved or terrified, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd finally chosen myself, and there was no going back now. The days following that confrontation were some of the darkest of my life, filled with angry text messages, calls from family members who'd been fed one-sided stories, and a crushing loneliness that made me question if I'd made the right choice. My phone would light up at all hours with messages from Linda telling me what a disappointment I was, how selfish I'd become, and how they'd raised me better than this. Aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions about my character, calling me cold-hearted and ungrateful without ever asking for my side of the story. The guilt was suffocating at times, and there were nights when I'd lie in my beautiful apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if maybe I really was the terrible person they were making me out to be. But something interesting started happening after about 2 weeks. My parents found another solution without my help, just like I knew they would if I stopped being their easy backup plan. Turns out, they hadn't actually exhausted all their options. They just wanted the easiest and most comfortable one, which was moving into my expensive downtown apartment rent-free. They ended up downsizing to a smaller place they could actually afford, selling some of the luxury items they'd bought on credit, and adjusting their lifestyle to match their real financial situation. The homelessness they'd threatened me with was never actually a real possibility. It was just another manipulation tactic designed to make me cave to their demands, and realizing that made me equal parts angry and relieved. The most painful part of the aftermath wasn't their anger or the family drama. It was accepting that my relationship with my parents would never be the same, and maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. We barely spoke for months, and when we finally did start talking again, it was surface level and distant. Nothing like the enmeshed, codependent relationship we'd had before. Some family members never came around, choosing to believe I was the villain in this story, and I had to make peace with the fact that not everyone would understand or support my decision. But the ones who truly mattered, Maya, Dr. Park, and a few cousins who dealt with similar family dynamics, stood by me and reminded me that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And as I sat in my apartment each evening, watching the city lights twinkle below, I realized that the peace I felt in my own space was worth every uncomfortable conversation, every guilt trip, and every relationship that had to evolve or end because of my choice to finally respect myself. Now, several months after that life-changing confrontation, I found myself sitting on my balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the downtown skyline, and actually feeling at peace for the first time in years. The relationship with my parents was still strained and probably always would be, but I'd stopped carrying the crushing weight of their expectations and disappointments on my shoulders every single day. I'd learned something crucial through this whole experience, that sacrifice without consent isn't love, it's control, and true family relationships should never require you to destroy yourself to keep others comfortable. If you're going through something similar right now and need a reminder that you're not alone, please subscribe and like this video. And drop a comment telling me what boundaries you're struggling to set, because sometimes just saying it out loud is the first step to claiming your power. What's the one boundary you know you need to set, but haven't found the courage to enforce yet? The most profound realization came when I stopped waiting for my parents to validate my decision and started validating it myself. For weeks after the confrontation, I'd catch myself checking my phone obsessively, hoping for a message that said they understood, that they were proud of me, that they finally saw me as a person with valid needs and feelings. But that message never came, and eventually I realized I didn't need it anymore because I'd given myself the validation I'd been seeking from them my entire life. I started journaling every morning about the things I was grateful for in my life, and my apartment was always at the top of the list. Not because of its value or location, but because it represented my freedom, my hard work, and my right to exist as an individual separate from my family's demands. Looking back now, I can see that this whole situation was never really about the apartment at all. It was about whether I had the courage to claim my own life and stop living according to someone else's script for me. The apartment was just the catalyst, the breaking point where I finally had something tangible worth fighting for, something I could point to and say, this is mine, and I deserve to protect it. Every person who's ever set a difficult boundary knows this feeling. The mixture of guilt, fear, relief, and empowerment that comes from finally choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. And while the journey was painful and messy and left scars on relationships I once thought were unbreakable, I wouldn't change a single thing because it taught me the most important lesson of my life. Your peace is not a sacrifice you owe to anyone, not even the people who raised you. The hardest part about setting a boundary isn't the initial conversation. It's the constant reinforcement that comes after, especially when people keep testing to see if you really mean it. My mother tried several more times over the following months to guilt me into changing my mind, showing up unannounced with boxes just in case I'd reconsidered, or calling me during family emergencies that somehow always required me to let them stay at my place temporarily. Each time, my heart would race, and that old familiar guilt would start creeping in, whispering that maybe I was being too harsh, maybe I should just give in this one time. But I'd learned from Dr. Park that boundaries without consistent enforcement are just suggestions, and if I caved even once, I'd be teaching them that all they had to do was push hard enough and long enough until I broke. I developed a simple script that I repeated every single time they tried to cross the boundary. I love you, but my answer hasn't changed, and it's not going to change. Those words became my anchor, my reminder that I didn't need to justify, argue, defend, or explain my decision every time they brought it up. At first, it felt robotic and cold to keep repeating the same sentence, but eventually I realized that's exactly what boundaries require: consistency, clarity, and the refusal to get drawn into circular arguments designed to wear you down. Robert tried a different approach, attempting to make me feel sorry for Linda by telling me how depressed she was that her own daughter had abandoned the family. But I recognized that manipulation tactic for exactly what it was and refused to take the bait. The real test came during Thanksgiving, when I had to decide whether to attend the family dinner, knowing my decision would be the elephant in the room that everyone would either ignore or weaponize against me. I went, but I set clear boundaries before I arrived. I'd stay for exactly 2 hours. I wouldn't discuss my apartment or living situation, and if anyone became hostile or disrespectful, I'd leave immediately without explanation or apology. Standing firm in that room full of people who thought I was selfish was one of the bravest things I'd ever done, and when Uncle Mike made a snide comment about my luxury palace that I wouldn't share with my struggling parents, I simply stood up, thanked the host, and walked out with my head held high. Driving home that night, I felt something I'd never experienced before: pride in my ability to protect my peace, even when it meant standing completely alone, and excitement about what my life could become now that I was finally living it for myself, instead of for everyone else's approval. A year after that confrontation, I barely recognized the person I'd become, and I mean that in the best possible way. I was stronger, more confident, and actually happy in a way I'd never experienced when I was constantly trying to please everyone else. The apartment that had once been a source of conflict and guilt had transformed into my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely without worrying about someone else's expectations weighing me down every single moment. I started hosting dinner parties with friends who actually celebrated my success instead of resenting it, and I finally understood what it meant to be surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not what I could give them. If you've been on your own journey of healing after setting difficult boundaries, Please subscribe and like this video. I'd love to hear your transformation stories in the comments. What's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself after finally choosing your own well-being over someone else's demands? The healing wasn't instant or linear. There were still days when I'd wake up feeling guilty, wondering if I'd been too harsh or if there was some compromise I'd missed that could have made everyone happy. But Dr. Park helped me understand that sometimes there is no compromise that works when one party refuses to respect your basic needs and autonomy, and that the guilt I was feeling wasn't actually mine. It was the residue of years of conditioning where I'd been taught that my worth was measured by how much I sacrificed for others. I started practicing self-compassion, talking to myself the way I'd talk to Maya if she were in my situation, and slowly that critical voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother started to fade, replaced by a kinder voice that reminded me I deserved peace, space, and respect just like everyone else. The personal evolution that came from this experience went far beyond just the apartment situation. It changed how I showed up in every area of my life, from my career to my friendships to my dating life. I got a promotion at work because I finally had the confidence to negotiate for what I deserved, instead of just accepting whatever was offered and being grateful for it. I ended a friendship with someone who constantly took advantage of my generosity because I recognized the same manipulation patterns I'd learned to identify with my parents. I even started dating someone who actually respected my boundaries and celebrated my independence instead of trying to make me feel guilty for having my own life. The apartment had been the catalyst, but the real transformation was learning that I didn't need anyone's permission to protect my peace, and that the people who truly loved me would respect my boundaries instead of constantly trying to push past them. So here I am today, sitting in my 900K downtown apartment that represents so much more than just real estate. It represents my freedom, my self-worth, and my refusal to sacrifice my well-being for people who saw me as a solution to their problems rather than a person with my own dreams and needs. The relationship with Linda and Robert is still complicated, still distant, and probably will never be the close, warm relationship I once imagined we'd have, but I've made peace with that because I finally understand that healthy relationships require mutual respect, and you can't have respect without boundaries. Sometimes saying no is the most important thing you can do for yourself, and if that makes you selfish in someone else's eyes, maybe their definition of selfishness is just their way of saying you're no longer convenient for them to use. The biggest lesson I learned through all of this is that protecting what you've worked for isn't selfish. It's self-preservation, and there's a massive difference between the two that took me 32 years to understand. Your family, your friends, or anyone else in your life doesn't get unlimited access to your time, your space, your money, or your peace just because they're related to you or because they need something from you. You are allowed to have things that are just yours, spaces that are just yours, and dreams that don't include making everyone else comfortable at the expense of your own happiness. The guilt that comes with setting boundaries is real and painful, but I promise you that the peace that comes after is worth every uncomfortable conversation, every angry phone call, and every relationship that has to evolve or end because of your decision to finally respect yourself. After hearing my story, I want you to ask yourself, what would you have done in my place? And more importantly, what boundaries do you need to set in your own life right now? Do you have people in your life who make you feel guilty for wanting things that are rightfully yours? Who use your love and loyalty as weapons to manipulate you into sacrificing your well-being for their convenience? If this story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar or you're going through it right now, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because you're not alone in this struggle. And sometimes just knowing that can make all the difference. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, your peace is not negotiable, your boundaries are not up for debate, and you deserve to live a life that's truly yours without carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations on your shoulders forever.